dealing importation and distribution of pharmaceuticals. I also work in a private community pharmacy where I get to get hands-on management of patients. Yeah, so that's me, and I'm passionate about pharmacy. I'm passionate about empowering women, and that's the whole agenda of today, and that's how we get linked to Marian, because you are a woman champion. We've read a lot about you, like, how did she get there? How can we get there? So it's women empowering women. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much, Harriet. That was very wonderful and empowering as well. So I'm going to get right in, and I'm very excited to now introduce our guest speaker. And she's also the president and CEO of Management Sciences for Health, which is commonly known as MSH. All of us refer to it as MSH, and that's none other than Marian Wentworth. Hi, Marian.
Hi.
Greetings once again. And I would like to take this opportunity to formally invite you to say hello to the entire team listening in today.
Greetings, everyone. It is such a pleasure to be here. As you heard ZACHEDO say, my name is Marian Wentworth. Since she gave her full name, my full name is Marian Willa Wentworth. I am named after, and I honor both my grandmothers, Marian and Willa, in my name, or at least my parents honored them, and I continue that tradition. And I have been president and CEO of Management Sciences for Health for 3.5 years. And before that, I had a 27-year career at a major multinational pharmaceutical company. It would be known as Merck Sharp and Dohme in most parts of the world. In the US and Canada, it's called Merck, but it's different than there's another Merck running around. So, my roles were in marketing at the beginning, and then I moved on to increasing responsibilities of general management. Probably the most famous thing that I did was to launch Gardasil, a cervical cancer or HPV vaccine, all over the globe. That was a huge part of my career at Merck. And when I resigned from that organization, I resigned as Vice President of Global Vaccine Strategy and Innovation. And at that point, Merck's vaccines business was something like a $6 billion portfolio. That gave me an opportunity to learn all kinds of more general management things, including licensing, mergers and acquisitions, and a lot of business kinds of stuff that we may get into, because I think business and pharmacy have huge intersections, as does pharmacy and patient care. So I'm really, really excited to be here. I'm happy to dive in more detail where you want. I can talk way too long, but I'm much happier answering questions than just delivering speeches.
Okay, thank you so much, Marian. And I would just like to inform everybody listening in today that this is how we are going to roll with today's discussion. We shall start off with a conversation with Marian, then, and after 30 to 35 minutes, we are going to be also looking into your questions. So in case you have any question that you'd like to ask, please just type it into the chat box. We shall give an opportunity to respond to your questions as well, and then we shall close the meeting. So Marian, right back to you. I would like to start right off with your past work experience. You've talked about the time you were with Merck Pharmaceuticals. It is a big global healthcare company. You were the vice president of innovation and strategy at some point. You have talked about your the portfolio. You had a very wide vaccine portfolio that were in charge of looking into different vaccines, right from hepatitis A, hepatitis B, tetanus vaccines. 3 years back, you came onto the MSH team as the global leader. But what is very surprising when we looked at your profile is you have done all this with an undergraduate degree in mathematics from Harvard University. Yeah. You know, we're not talking, you have moved against the stream. The main norm is we look at advancing in our careers. I have to have great academic accolades. I have to have so many masters. I have to have so many PhDs. You have done that without the norm, without following the norm. So my first question to you is, first of all, what motivated you to come into the healthcare sector with a minimal background and training in health?
Okay. So I've actually had a personal passion around health since I was tiny. I started reading about nutrition, for instance, and mental health in my early teens. I became a vegetarian when I was 12 for health reasons, but also for save the planet kinds of reasons. And I started reading a lot of, even young at age 14, which is a crazy thing to do, by the way. I don't recommend it. And I'm sure I didn't understand it, but I was really, really interested in the idea that healthcare requires understanding the whole body. Your mental health, your nutritional health, that was as close to a public health perspective as I had. The other determinants of health were not in my head, but those three were in my head. And a very tiny period of time where I thought about medical school. But I grew up with two parents who don't have college degrees and who supported learning, but the notion of being in school for a long period of time felt impossibly expensive for my family. It was only because of the support of teachers that I got in first to I got a scholarship to a good private school. And then through that private school, I got support to, or even was coached into trying, I just wouldn't have tried, to apply to a place like Harvard. And it turned out that there were scholarships available there too. But the scholarships available didn't pay everything. And so and that was true in high school and that was true in college. So I actually started working in a manufacturing organization when I was 13 years old. What I had was this is the 1970s, just to tell you how old I am. I had math skills and I was able to learn computer skills quickly. Now this is back when tiny computers that are less powerful than your phone occupied huge rooms. But my mother had a job there. She got me a job and then I learned how to program machine tools. And when I got to college, I still had to work. And so I worked in areas that were related to the fact that I knew something about manufacturing. And so by the time I got to the end of college, I actually got a job in a consulting firm and I learned how to do, this is relevant to pharmacy, logistics and distribution work. I would do computer models and I learned the math. That part was easy for me because I'm very blessed with a head that can think that way, that can think in a process and computer and mathematical kind of way. And I ended up working for a consulting firm that had, as consultants, members of the faculty of both the Harvard and MIT business schools. And they brought me in to, a bunch of white men, by the way, but they brought me in to different kinds of business cases. And so I feel like I went to business school through real live case studies. And as I started applying for roles after 4 years, I really wanted to live with my decisions, because when you work as a consultant, you come in, you solve a problem, you hand them. At that point, it was a binder of information. Now, sometimes that's not how we do it, but we give them a website. But nonetheless, and I was worried that some of those binders would just collect dust on shelves of organizations and that I could put together better binders if I worked in an organization. And that's when I went back to my healthcare roots and said, I really want to see if I can't get into a healthcare organization. Merck actually hired me. I thought I was going to work in supply chain in, say, a pharmaceutical company or something like that. But Merck actually hired me into marketing because one of the things that MSD or Merck wanted me to do, wanted was to have some folks who had that quantitative discipline to apply to marketing questions. They really wanted to look at marketing as a science and not just as a bunch of glossy, fancy brochures. Shame on them, because of course I wasn't satisfied just doing the quantitative side. Then I wanted to learn the rest. And what is now called the science of behavior change was hugely the way that Merck approached launching new therapeutic class after new therapeutic class. And for you pharmacists in the audience who are, you know, a little geeky about this, that was at around the launch of statins, the launch of angiotensin converting inhibitors, the launch of proton pump inhibitors. You know, there were huge changes going on with respect to how pharmaceuticals change standard of care, particularly in the NCD world, in the non-communicable disease world. And then it moved into the infectious disease world. Merck also launched one of the first protease inhibitors for HIV. And so it moved from there. And then I discovered vaccines, and I discovered public health. And influencing health across broad populations, you know, it's partly about individual care, individual treatment decision, but it's partly about how we make those moves and those nudges that are going to, you know, save thousands of lives all at the same time. That was really exciting. And so I spent 13 years of my career at in the vaccines division, which still has a soft spot in my heart. Anyway, I told you I can give you long answers, so I hope that's
so in supplement to what you have just talked about, you have acquired your skills through exposure from your previous work experiences, or what has helped you build healthcare related skills that are happening that have helped you to build the career that you have today? Is there a point, because as part of the teams that you're leading, you're having expert doctors, academic researchers, you have pharmacists, you're leading a very diverse and expert team of global healthcare specialists. Is there a point where you felt you didn't belong? Just with you don't have
every single day. Yeah, so, you know, let me go back to manufacturing for a minute. You can bet that in almost every meeting that I was in, I was the only female that wasn't serving coffee in the room. And not just that there were more men than women, but in the manufacturing environment, there was definitely a level of machismo that was hugely important. And it wasn't boardroom machismo, it was more like factory floor machismo. And if what you are is the young girl, and by the way, I looked very young, I had my hair in a ponytail, I wore bangs, but I was whip smart. I could make computers dance as far as they were concerned. And so I could actually be intimidating. I could actually scare people. I was terribly insecure. I felt like I didn't belong all the time. And so I was always trying to prove that at least I was smart, which meant I was making it worse. And it took a long time to start understanding that being smart isn't, first of all, that I have to relax and I have to have more confidence in myself, own what I know, own what I don't know, you know, name what I don't know, perhaps before others do, or assume that many other people actually don't know a lot of things too. Or occasionally imagine them naked, or, you know, some other technique to just, you know, stop being so worried, because as soon as you're insecure, that insecurity translates into, for me anyway, bad judgment and bad behaviors. And so what I learned to add to my I'm smart is my I get you. I learned how to listen. I learned how to ask questions that were not teach me how the world works, you know, not questions that made me look smaller and unknowledgeable, but questions that made me look interested and look like I was trying to connect. And I think that's actually hugely, hugely important. That we try and park our insecurities. You know, I'm very used to performance, and my girls dance ballet and, you know, things like that. And there can be all kinds of craziness going on behind the curtain. What matters is what goes on in front of the curtain, right? It doesn't matter. So whatever's inside your head that tells you that you haven't learned enough yet, that there are still things you don't know, that there's some degree that you don't have, you know, you've got to find a way to park that and say, look, I know something. Nobody knows everything. And the other thing I know is that something I have is going to be relevant and useful and deliver value for others. And part of my job is to connect well enough with others so that I can understand where I can deliver value.
Okay. Let's focus a bit more on what you have just previously shared as a leader. I hear you talking about issues to do with, at some point you felt you didn't belong, you had your insecurities. Now, if we're looking at the statistics today, if you look at the World Health Assembly, we have only about 25% of global healthcare leadership positions are being occupied by women. Yet approximately 75% of the global healthcare workforce is comprising of women. And we are seeing organizations such as the World Health Organization being pushed to get more women into their senior leadership roles. Now, there have been quite a number of conversations going back and forth about challenges of women in leadership. And some of the concerns women continue to share is lack of guidance, lack of mentorship, how to balance family responsibilities with the work-related requirements that you have to meet in order to be promoted. Some talk about outright gender discrimination within the workplace. Others about the fear that I think you earlier on hinted just a little bit on, but the fear is real. And some people just drown and remain in that fear, stagnant for a very long time to actually push forward and get out of positions, get out of basic service and take on more leadership roles and positions. So based on your own experience, what advice would you give us as women, whereby we need to take collective action to continue supporting ourselves to get out of that space?
That's a leading question. And I'm actually going to answer it in two parts, if I may. But they both, the punchline is still get out of your own head. First, a story. I was mentoring a young female engineer who had very young children, who was really trying to incubate a project that could be very transformative for vaccines. And I thought was very important. But of course, it had to go through a lot of different decisions before the next phase would be funded. And so she would come to me looking for, I wasn't in her area at all, but looking for advice on how she should comport herself. It was a very male-dominated area. And she was very worried about whether she could move this project along, and she worked really hard. She crossed every T, she dotted every I. She worked long hours. And at one point when we were talking, she said to herself, and this was, towards the end of the calendar year, she said, if I've missed all this time with my daughter because of blah, 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 blah. I said, okay, time out. We have Christmas holiday coming up very soon, and you've got a young daughter who's watching all the decisions that you make. Instead of telling yourself what you should do in terms of how you think about your time and whether or not this project is worth what you're giving into it, I want you to look through her eyes. I want you to think about the choices that you want her to make when she's an adult. And then your job is to model the choices you'd want her to see. And so that was a way of her thinking about her own sort of work-life balance and her own commitment to career. And she didn't, by the way, she did not decide, oh no, that means I have to spend 100% of her time at home with her daughter and quit her job. She didn't go in that direction because she doesn't want her daughter to do that. But she did decide that maybe there were a few times when she could just go home, when 85% was probably 120% of what people were expecting. 85% of her standards was 120% of what was needed. And it caused her, and it gave her some distance. So that's one way to get out of your head, is to find, some space that really matters to you, that allows you to think through other people's eyes. The other is to go talk to and I'm going to be, very gender biased here, go talk to a girlfriend, or a professional colleague, or whatever. And you and I discussed this a little bit yesterday. When we write a resume, for instance, we have a tendency to try and be as women, we have a tendency to try and be extremely honest about what we haven't done as well as what we have done. And that tends to mean that things that we actually know, if we're not totally confident that they're good enough, we'll keep them off our resume. That's when you get your colleagues, especially your best friend, to go look at it. You need to talk yourself up. You need to put your best foot forward. People, when they read CVs, when they read these kinds of bios and so forth, are going to assume you inflated it, and they're going to take it down a notch. So if you've already taken it down a notch, by the time they read it, they're going to look at something that's even smaller than what the truth is. So you have to get your friends to help you credibly ladder up to your best self and put your best self in front. And you can do that when you prepare for interviews. You can do that when you're thinking about how to present a project. That is one place where we can help each other do better.
Great. That's a very key issue I've mentioned, that is a challenge to us as women in pharmacy. How can we be able to see each other's strengths and support each other to bring them out? That's a great point, Marian. Thank you so much. So I'm thinking we dive a little bit more into pharmacy as a global health sector. One of the biggest elephant in the room right now across the globe is the COVID-19 pandemic. We have seen the great deterioration it has had on global healthcare systems, supply chain management systems, and so many organizations are continuing to invest quite a number of resources to reevaluate their healthcare system challenges so that they can be able to design future evidence-based strategies that are focused not only on the provision of quality services, but also ensuring building resilience and sustainability for future pandemics or future disasters that might strike. So with that background, let's focus on the pharmaceutical sector. With the work that MSH is doing today, what has been exposed as the greatest gaps that we are having within the pharmaceutical sector? That for the pharmacists that are listening in today, we ought to take time, work on ourselves in order to better front our skills in managing those gaps if we're going to be relevant in the new normal.
Yeah. So unfortunately, there are many, many gaps. And there are gaps for low and middle income countries and for high income countries in some spaces. First of all, there are certainly gaps in terms of medicine quality. And that is particularly an issue of low and middle income countries. And that also means that governments don't necessarily know how to assess quality, how to track, how to surveil for adverse experiences. There's a lot of pharmacy-related skills that we need. We've gotten much better about understanding how to regulate at the high end. Is this product going to be licensed in my country or not? Although there are still places where that can be strengthened. But now, is it being kept in cold chain? And more to the point, is it being diluted, diverted? Those kinds of things are huge, huge issues. And so being very smart about supply chain is actually, supply chain and pharmacovigilance are hugely important. But there's the other side too, which, as I probably already alluded to, that I really care about, which is, the last mile isn't really getting it to a pharmacy. It isn't even really getting it to a patient. It's getting it in the patient's mouth or however it's delivered at the right time, at the right dose. There's a lot about medicine's benefits that matter, and a lot of the determinants of that are technical in terms of what we traditionally teach, as I understand it, at pharmacy schools, but some of it is about what we are starting to teach more, but aren't necessarily as good at, and that's the science of behavior change. You know, helping patients, and I've done lots of research on this when I was at Merck, helping patients understand what the goals of their therapy are, helping them understand how they should be taking their therapy, what they should be looking for if it doesn't work, and getting them out of their heads. You know, there's a little bit of a theme here. You know, if one of the things that you're treating is something that feels like sort of it's behavior related in the patient's head, then if they're too full of stigma, full of I'm a bad person, full of, you know, those other kinds of emotions, then successfully taking their therapy is not there. So what gets me excited about your group, about women being, you know, really active and engaged in pharmacy is, and again, I'm being biased, I'm very pro women. But it is that we do care about connecting, and we do work on what are called, and I don't like the terminology, but called the soft side of the work we do, in addition to the, I don't know, more technical side. And even that terminology just shows you how people prioritize those things. They're all technical skills, and they're extremely important for getting to truly the last millimeter or maybe the last milligram.
Okay, so you have highlighted supply chain management, you have highlighted pharmacovigilance, you have talked greatly about pharmaceutical care approach, whereby pharmacists, we ought to become more integrated in patient health care. And the areas that you're actually mentioning, I have to say, are already very much so in practice. Maybe we need to improve in them with time. But I would like to throw a stone in the future, 5-10 years from today. You know, one thing I can say, if I look at the traditional role of a pharmacist, as pharmacists, our traditional, we started off as keen in manufacture and compounding of medication, then, and the administration of drugs, dispensing. Then slowly by slowly, pharmaceutical care has been more integrated in just a few years back. Pharmacists were not really so much involved in clinical setting, but now they are heavily involved in clinical setting. Pharmacists were not involved in public health, but now we're seeing them in program delivery, we're seeing them in research, you're talking about pharmacovigilance, we're seeing pharmacists in pharmacy policy formulation and implementation and regulation. Now, 5 years, I'm sure we shall be looking at also new areas for pharmacists as well. And one of the challenges we have is you have to continuously be evolving yourself as a professional. You have to know, what does my career demand and how can I continue putting my best foot forward so that I can be able to remain visible and relevant in the public health arena or in the clinical health arena. So throwing a stone in the future, where do you see key technical areas that we ought to pay quite a lot of, you know, keep watching carefully, pay quite a lot of interest in, that are going to be demanded from us as pharmaceutical healthcare professionals?
So let me first cover some of the non-technical areas that I know you also spend time on, but I think we've got to really up the focus and attention. And those are around business skills, leadership management, understanding credit, understanding cash flow, learning how to negotiate, being able to balance, manage a balance sheet, and basic sales. Those are skills that aren't necessarily thought of as pharmacy skills, but more and more we're going to see a role, a higher definition of the role for private sector and the role for public sector. And harnessing private sector, even if you have a government related job, understanding how you're going to partner with private sector, I think is hugely important. And that aside, the first set of skills I talked about, the leadership skills and the management skills, you use those everywhere. You can demonstrate even in a public hospital that if you do leadership training at that hospital, you can improve outcomes without covering any disease specific information whatsoever. because people get much better at managing resources, at aligning around a common vision, at doing work well. So let me throw that in first. I am very, very conscious of, and I've lived for decades in this divide between doctors and pharmacists. It's a huge, huge divide, even though doctors prescribe pharmaceuticals and pharmacists deliver patient care or make clinical protocol decision-making and so forth. But the fact that our training comes from different places, that the kinds of professionals that are attracted actually attract different aptitudes and personality types, between the two, means that we are not integrating pharmacy into a holistic view of medicine as well as we could. And that statement is across the board. It doesn't matter what country you're from. That problem is around, even if you get to a place where it's highly, highly integrated. You have all these forces externally that pull it apart again. I think one of the things that is changing over the next 5 years that will put a very fine point on that is the way health information is moving. It is becoming more and more, people can talk about AI, big data, pick your buzzwords, it's moving. And all kinds of variations in practice over time, we're actually going to be able to see and harvest a lot better. There are already groups trying. There are already groups with large, large data sets. For me, I think understanding pharmacy in the context of big data is going to be a very robust area. Right now in COVID-19, one of the things that makes me extremely sad is despite all the new collaboration that's going on amongst scientists, and I do some work on the side in looking at vaccine development programs, so I've had some visibility to what's going on there. It's extraordinary. But nonetheless, in individual hospitals, in individual clinics, doctors' offices, and homes, people are trying things. People are trying all sorts of things. And they did in the early days of HIV. Uganda's got a great story around that. Great, rich story, let's call it that. But those are what, my husband's a physicist, so he would call those naturally occurring experiments because we're all kind of experimenting. But we're not putting what we learned together. And over time, as more health information becomes more electronic, then all the mistakes we made and all the successes we have are actually mistakes and successes that other people can start building on. Right now, we just have them over and over again in every community. And it makes me very, very sad because it's a complete waste. I think we would be much further along in terms of treatment, just practical, what we can do, even non-pharmaceutical treatment, if we could harvest that data now.
Okay, so you have talked greatly about the non-technical areas, which was actually a question I was going to ask you earlier. So it was good you actually brought it up before I could ask it. In the technical areas, you've talked greatly about IT, the revolution of IT, even in the pharmacy business sector. Do we have any other areas that you would per se look into aside from IT?
Yeah, it's health financing. We are all trying to progress towards universal health care in one way or another. And that means that some of the things that insurance companies know about actuarial risk, some of the things that people know about, cost spreading, and is going to be hugely, hugely important. And I think pharmacists should not be naive to that trend. One of the things that happened in the United States was that when some of the early insurance schemes were put in place in the 1960s, the pharmaceutical companies decided they didn't want to be a part of that. And that has resulted in pharmaceuticals being viewed by the population overall as sort of separate from the rest of healthcare, and the costs being borne separately from the rest of healthcare. So if you look at US news stories and you just analyze the content, there will be story after story about how terrible pharmaceutical costs are. What people actually do not know about healthcare in the United States is less than 10% of total healthcare costs in the United States are from pharmaceuticals. And 80% of those are for generic pharmaceuticals, which in the United States are actually priced on average much lower than they are in, say, Europe and many other countries around the globe. So the facts don't support the rhetoric, whereas what is ballooning are hospital costs, insurance costs, et cetera. And that has a ramification for pharmacists. If you're running a business, it has an issue. If you're actually trying to participate as a stakeholder in overall patient-centered care, or if you're actually trying to work in the pharmaceutical business itself, in all those places, it's a huge handicap to think of pharmacy as separate. And so I think when it comes to health financing, that we have to be a player at the table, or we will build walls that will shut us out for decades to come. I think that's what we learned out of the US system.
Thank you, Marian. I want to wrap up with my questions, and I open up the group Q&A. And my last question to you is, as a Women in Pharmacy platform, we continue to seek learning. You have given us some great information today that I hope members are going to go digest further and see the path that they want to take and use with the information you have shared. But at the same time, are there example programs or networks that you could be able to introduce us to as a group that can enable this kind of continuous learning, that can enable this us meeting like-minded professionals to keep on hearing different views and perspectives to continue enhancing our learning as well?
Yeah, so thank you for that question, and thanks for sending it to me in advance too, because I really did appreciate a chance to think about it. I love what I would call an affinity group. Why in the world am I calling myself? Sorry, excuse me. The fact that women can support other women is hugely, hugely important. It allows us to shed a light on some issues that we have that might be different. We also need to infiltrate the other side. Mm-hmm. So what we cannot do is always be talking to ourselves and assume that it's always women's job to advance women. We need to find ways to encourage men to advance women as well. And so I think as we think about our choices around how we spend our time in professional environments, that we've got to do a little bit of both. And we should also be doing things to put pressure on or reward positive behaviors for men. So I suggested to you yesterday that you should think about whether you should have prizes or other kinds of things that put a focal point on men who've advanced diversity, because we need to make that a thing. But in terms of professional societies, Women in Global Health is an organization that is still fairly young, but I think very dynamic, and they're very supportive of creating new chapters. I don't know if there's one in Uganda. I didn't do that much desk research before, but if there is, join it. If there isn't, create it. Because I think you'll find that you get support at a global level, but you also can support one another locally, or perhaps you can participate as Women in Pharmacy as part of Women in Global Health. There's that. Then I really would encourage you, and I don't know the national pharmacy associations within Uganda, but I would strategize, if I were you, about not only which ones you want to be in, but which leadership roles you want to get to. And I think you should be working together to see if you can't find one or more of those amongst you who can rise into visible ranks within those societies. Because the more people see women in those roles, the more the norms will shift. And I would be pretty shameless about that, actually. I think it's extremely important.
Thank you, Marian. I have had a great chat with you. I hope you have as well. And would like to open up the questions from our chat box. So I'd like to hand it over to you, Harriet.
Thank you so much, Marianne. This was really enlightening, and we are proud that you are our champion woman leader And one of the questions is, as a woman leader, what challenges have you faced, and how have you overcome, or what tips do you have to share with us on overcoming the obstacles along the way so that we can keep climbing? Because it's easy to give up at the first obstacle, but you can share with us some of the challenges and how you've been able to overcome them so we can learn from you.
Yeah. So we've talked about a couple of them. One is sometimes I stand out as the oddball, I'm the only woman, I'm the only mathy one, I'm the only, one that knows something about foreign languages. In the US, that's an issue. We all have reasons why we stand out differently. One of the things I learned over time, because I also grew up in a scrappy area, I didn't necessarily dress well, I didn't put on, I didn't have good haircuts, I didn't wear the right clothes, is I started to figure out how I could fit in where I wanted to fit in. The superficial things like the haircut, the clothes, the costume, if you will, back to that performance analogy. Things that wouldn't change who I was as a person, but would make me more accessible to the people around me. And I think we all know, what that can potentially mean. The person who always wears something that everyone else, the skirt that's too short, too long, whatever. There are different norms, and I made some personal choices about which ones I wanted to adopt. And that didn't really change who I was. I would never ask if if headdress is part of your religious beliefs, I'd never ask you not to do that, or vice versa, wear a headdress in a place where it's not that I wouldn't ask you to do. But I would ask you to think about, all those other things. And I also would build alliances with other people. There's a word that people, it's not a real word, but people talk about heap-eating. That's like the word repeat with he, the pronoun he at the front. One of the things that often happens, and this is true in many countries, is you'll be sitting around in a boardroom or a meeting room, and a woman will throw out an idea or make a statement, and the conversation will go. Nobody heard it. Everybody's thinking about what they want to say next. Nobody's listening to one another. And then some man says the same thing, 2 seconds later or 2 minutes later. Oh, John, that's a great idea. So one of the things we can do is sometimes we can actually own our idea in a polite way, but we can also for each other say, as Sheila said, that was, I'm glad you appreciate John, that kind of thing. I think it's pretty important that we help one another around those things. And I think it's pretty important that we try to build alliances with folks who are not like ourselves. That very macho white guy that is always just thwarting whatever you're trying to put forward in a meeting. Sit down, go have lunch with them. Or if that's not acceptable in your culture, ask for time to review some questions or review a project you're preparing for. Find ways to connect. And I recognize that in different cultural contexts, those ways can be very different. And occasionally you even need a broker. Like you might need someone to arrange a small meeting around a topic. So it's going to vary depending on where you are. But there are often ways to do that, to connect and to create some kind of more personal relationship. What you should not do is bring, goodies and sweet treats in, or, just talk about cricket or your children, or, if your relationship is then only superficial, if it's not grounded in something professional, then that's what you'll have. You'll have a personal relationship. There's nothing wrong with introducing personal if it feels right. But as you find ways to connect outside of where the decision-making happens, make sure that you're still working on your brand, that you're still presenting yourself as a professional, perhaps the three-dimensional professional with children or a husband or whatever, but as a professional.
Thank you so much, Marianne. One last question. Many of us right now are at crossroads, you know, with our career, with where we want to go, a professional, passion, which may take us out of the profession. So we are at crossroads. We want to understand from you, like from your experiences, how critical or how important is it to specialize, like seek out an area of specialization or go for a doctoral studies? How relevant is it in terms of career building?
Yeah, so I'm not sure that I have always been strategic about my career, but I think that there are two threads to building your own strategic plan for yourself. One is understanding what kind of professional you want to be, really knowing what fits your personality, your aptitude, your capabilities. Do you love going deep? Are you more of a generalist? Are you more of an introvert? Are you more of an extrovert? You know, just be honest with yourself about who you are as a person, and then start to think about what kinds of career roles you'd love to have. I always recommend that you have a plan, that you hold it loosely because life does all kinds of things to you along the way, but that you always have a plan so it helps guide your next set of decisions. And then revisit your plan. And then the other half of the strategy is trying to figure out what might work best right at the moment. And that's that sort of game, you know, people are hiring the person who has these credentials, people are hiring the people who have private sector experience, people are hiring those sorts of things. Those things are generally more temporal. You know, they change over time. So if your entire strategy is around what works and isn't true to who you want to be as a professional, then I think you will find yourself being very unsatisfied with your career always, because you're always trying to please the system in one way or another. So don't be stupid about the system. You have to be savvy. But if you see that there are a whole set of roles that require a PhD and you don't have really the desire to spend that much time with those fat books, or you really don't want to write a long dissertation or put together all the analysis that goes into it, then don't. If you don't love the journey along the way, you're never going to be excited by the destination, because I'll give you a secret. There is no destination. You compose a life. You do not succeed and win at the game of life.
Well, thank you so much. Just one last one to wrap up the conversation.
We actually have two questions.
Okay, just one. What top 3 books do you see would you advise us to read that have molded you into the type of woman that you are today?
Yeah, I think that's a lot. I read a lot, especially earlier in life. I read a lot, and I also read a lot of fiction. And I actually want to put in a plug for fiction, particularly fiction from interesting writers, because part of how you develop your leadership skills is role-playing scenarios. And when you go to fiction, you actually start thinking about lots and lots of scenarios that you haven't personally been in, but you get kind of gifted experience from the perspective of various authors. So I suggest a variety. I am a generalist, so that is part of my bias anyway. But there were 3 books that I noted down as I was thinking about this question that I think cover aspects of leadership and or work-life balance, etc., that I would love to suggest. One is a book called Emotional Intelligence from Daniel Goleman. And the reason for that is that emotional intelligence, that ability to relate to diverse kinds of people and put them together, is hugely, hugely important. And it's not just making virtue of something that women have a tendency to do naturally anyway. It is recognizing that there are some serious gaps in some of these hierarchical institutions where mostly men, but not always, hire people who look just like them. They create a problem in terms of overall innovation and resilience for their organizations. And I think there are several books that could cover it, but Dan Goleman does as good a job as anybody. Then there's another one that I wonder if it has too many US specific examples, but the concept is extremely important. And it's called 168 Hours by Laura Vanderkam. And 168 hours is 24 times 7. That's how many hours there are in a week. And in that book, she talks about analyzing how you spend your time and figuring out those things that are really your value add, unique contribution. Maybe it's not cooking for your children. Maybe that's something that you can get someone else to do, or you can find shortcuts so you don't try and be the best at it, you know. And maybe it's, you know, figure out what you want to do in your whole life, how much time you want to spend sleeping, meditating, paying attention to your loved ones, as well as work, and putting it all in context. And I think she does a really nice job of helping you think practically. I do say, though, that the examples are all US based. So that might be a little frustrating. I'll trust one of you will take the lead and look at it and see what you think. And then there's another one that, you know, I could spend an hour talking about this. It really exploits something called expectation bias. But it's called What Got You Here Won't Get You There. And it's by a guy named Marshall Goldsmith. And essentially he makes, I think, millions of dollars a year, but anyway, a lot of money coaching CEOs to help people participate and expect that they will change when they want to change. And I think that his approach to analyzing himself and helping influence the environment around him is useful for folks at lots of different levels. It is not just a CEO book. And it's wickedly funny. I've read parts of it out loud to my children who just laugh at how crazy the guy is. So anyway, there's a few ideas.
Thank you so much. That we're going to be on the outlook for those books. Over to you, Ziada.
Yeah, just the very last question, Marian, in the chat box is, there's a general perception that recruitment into global organizations such as the UN, World Bank, and MSH as well, but on a global level, is not always open to applicants, that usually these organizations have their own people who they put into such positions, even if the position has been advertised. What has been your experience around this area?
Yeah, well, I actually can't speak to, I hope MSH is not guilty of that, but I know that there's always a bit of that occurs because me as a hiring manager, when I'm hiring someone, I'm looking for the best candidate for the role sometimes, and particularly when I was early on at MSH, it has to be somebody who's done the job before. And sometimes our donors actually require people who have done the job before. And that really gets in the way of advancing and stretching individuals who are close to being able to do the job but haven't gotten there yet. And that can sometimes feel like you're hiring familiar faces or friendly faces. We are really putting a lot of effort into trying to make sure that we're not doing that. There is value to institutional knowledge, and when you have a whole team of folks who are doing something for the first time, having one that's experienced is hugely, hugely important. But when you get too comfortable and you only hire comfortable choices, then you miss something in terms of creativity and innovation, as well as diversity.
Hi, I can't hear her. Harriet, can you hear me?
we have to be grateful to Marian for this initiative and take it up. So please send us your contacts so that we can be able to send them to her so you can download them into their database. Thank you so much, Marian, for the opportunity. We are really, really grateful. ZACHEDO is back. I'll give her an opportunity to wrap it up. Please unmute your mic.
Yes, sorry. Sorry, guys. I didn't know that. So sorry about that. I had a little bit of power challenges, but then I'm back. Marian, thank you so much for the time you have given us. We're very grateful for your insights, for your experience. Quite a lot to learn in a very short period of time, but we shall take it upon ourselves to put these initiatives in practice. And maybe just to let the participants who are present today is that I was communicated to send the participant attendance list for the session to the MSH recruitment team so they can put it into their potential employee database. In that case that there's some future projects in Uganda, they can be able to have us in their database and they can communicate for any professionals who might be interested in some of the roles that the projects have to offer. So I will be sending in your contacts since all of us registered for the session. So I have your details and I'll be sending this to the MSH team. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you so much, Marian, and have yourselves a great evening. Have yourselves a great day, Marian. I know it's morning in Pennsylvania, but we should wish you a great day. And thank you so much for sharing.
Stay well, everyone.
Okay. Okay, bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Okay, Harriet. Welcome back. I think that was great.
Well done to you.
Okay. I think that was great. I think everything worked within time. We got people to ask their questions. So yeah, I think that is it.